Thank you for the encouragement. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be invited to Texas Lutheran, and I've had a nice trip down and getting to see a beautiful campus. Jackie told me this was a small campus. I don't think it's that small. Of course, up at A&M, we got a pretty big campus. Now, the ideas that you're about to hear were apropos of Professor Parsons' last comment. Form part of the content of the first Alvin Plantinga Scholar lecture ever delivered at the University of Notre Dame, which was delivered by me just because I happened to be the first Alvin Plantinga Scholar. They named the scholarship after Al the year before I got it the second time. And Al was sitting there in the audience, and it really disappoints me to think that he was sitting there thinking that all this stuff I'm about to give you was shallow and frivolous and trivial, and so no doubt you'll think so too, but he never said so afterward. But he's a nice guy. He was probably just being kind to me. So this is going to be a little garbled, but I'll apologize in advance for that. I'd like to start out by talking a little about how it is that we react to evil, and I think that there are two kinds of reactions that one can talk about, and they depend on two entirely different sorts of circumstances. Okay, now the first kind of reaction I'm going to talk about is what happens in actual practical circumstances when the reality of evil is actually experienced rather than just talked about, okay, by others or ourselves, and we're trying to address the actual experience. And I think the answer is that in these kinds of practical circumstances, our tendency is to attend to the problem, to try to do something about it, okay? At the very least, to escape it, right? To get out of the way, or help others to get out of the way, okay? But at times it's possible to do a lot more. You know, you can take action that can be thought of as overcoming the evil or at least making progress against it. When we can do that, we usually try, or we consider it to be a good idea to try. Okay, now it's possible for this to happen, you know, on a pretty grand scale. You know, consider something like the Green Revolution, which is basically the development of strains of crops that were far more productive, that made the land far more productive in impoverished parts of the world, and did a great deal to eliminate starvation in what are now called emerging countries. Or consider social measures that are undertaken in an effort to overcome crime, especially juvenile crime, or efforts to wipe out disease, like current efforts to, well, at least alleviate the scourge of AIDS in Africa, which have been actually quite successful. They've been going on for the last several years. So those are pretty big, and they have to do with, you know, trying to help out a whole lot of people. Sometimes this scale isn't anywhere near so grand. You know, there are times when we just, you know, give food to someone who's hungry or comfort someone who's suffered some sort of loss. Or you could do it with yourself. You know, you can take an aspirin for a headache, right, and try to do something about it, right? Or you could resolve to overcome the drinking habit that led to the headache, right? That'd be another way of trying to tackle the problem, okay? Now, in other cases, especially when the evil is one that we suffer, right, there's not that much you can do sometimes to address or change the evil itself, right? Some suffering basically has to be borne, right? Physical malady may have no cure. Not that there's no way of dealing with, but you think of something like blindness or just pain that's sometimes associated with various sorts of diseases, okay? Now, even in these cases, it's not as if, however, it's not as if there's nothing that can be done. Because if you can't fix the problem, we may still be able to fix your reaction to it, right? So in particular, you can see to it that we don't feel sorry for ourselves, that we don't end up obsessed with the question, why is this happening to me, right? That we stop acting as though we were somebody special, and that we bear our problems with the patience and fortitude of adults and not the ceaseless repining of children, okay? And we can see to it that we don't inflict ourselves on others, right? And that we don't behave as though just because we feel miserable, the whole rest of the world is obligated to feel miserable too, right? Okay, in short, you can take the attitude, if you can't do anything about a problem, you can at least quit complaining about it, you know, quit belly aching and try and give ourselves and others a little bit of peace. Okay? Now, the second kind of reaction that we can have about evil involves theoretical circumstances, where instead of the reality of evil, you're facing the abstract problem of evil, okay? And here the reaction tends to be entirely different, especially where the topic of religion is also on the table, which it needn't necessarily be, okay? And here our behavior is entirely different, or likely to be, right? So we formulate the problem, usually as an apparent incompatibility between the goodness, power, and wisdom usually attributed to God and the presence of evil in the world, as Professor Parson did. And here we do want answers, right? We do want to know why this happens to us. And if we're troubled about why an omnibenevolent God would allow the travail that affects the world, then we will repine. We will dwell on the severity of the problem, if only to emphasize the difficulty of discovering a justification that would square things, okay? We imagine, anyway. That would leave us satisfied that the God of traditional belief might plausibly be thought to exist in spite of all the evil. And of course, the irony is that we seldom realize that in framing the issue in this way, in the theoretical discussion, we may be exhibiting the very sort of attitude that in circumstances where evil must actually be faced would be considered immature, embarrassing, and to reflect poorly on the character of the people who display it, and the person who displays it, okay? Okay, so I want to urge that if you face up to that irony, or if we face up to that irony, we might be able to make a little progress with the problem of evil, okay? So, see where we are here. This is, as you can see, a work in progress. So what's the state of the problem? Well, the state of the problem is something like this, that we have this premise that a good God would seek as far as possible to minimize the amount of evil in the world in some pretty much straightforward way, okay? So that there would be evil only if there was a good reason for it being there, okay? Now, probably the most popular response to this sort of thing in recent years has been the so-called free will defense or employment of free will theodicies, okay? That distinguish moral evil and natural evil in the way that Professor Parsons did, and then lay the moral evil at the feet of folks, creatures who have free will, right, rather than at God's feet, okay? Now, there are a lot of problems with that kind of approach, and I've kind of criticized it in other locations. But in any case, I want to sort of set that one aside because what happens if you want to avoid the free will defense is you begin to focus on other sorts of evil. You focus on seemingly gratuitous evils, and they most often involve severe suffering. Okay. Some are, imposing alleged gratuitous evils just by their sheer size. Okay. So among moral evils, you would think about the Holocaust, but when you do, you think about the suffering of the victims, not, a little bit more. I mean, when we think of the Holocaust, we tend to think of the suffering of the victims. We don't tend to think about we do think about it, but we don't tend to think as much about the character of the perpetrators, although that's a puzzling thing. Or if you think of natural things that are really big, like the tsunami that occurred in Indonesia a couple of years ago, okay? Other evils don't impress so much by their magnitude as by the innocence and helplessness of the victims, okay? So like abuse of children, or the suffering of animals in natural disaster, like Rose Fawn caught in the forest, okay? Now, as an initial response to these sorts of problems, you could try Professor Craig's response, which is the unknown purpose response, which is not just, of course, the claim that we don't know why these evils occur out there, but it's the claim that we shouldn't expect to be able to know, okay? Rather, what you do is, especially, you might have some idea, like in general, of what might be a justification for God to cause suffering. But if you get it down, where you want a justification for each particular case, then really there are a lot of cases where you're just going to throw up your hands, But the claim is that we really should not expect to know. Usually the reason here is that God's wisdom so far outstrips our own that they would have no idea of what his purposes might be. And some must expect that, there may be a lot of seemingly gratuitous evil, but that it wouldn't wind up being gratuitous in the long run. Now, I don't really like this approach much more than Professor Parsons does, because Because, I mean, it's true that it kind of leaves us dead center on the issue. You know, we don't get, what happens is we don't react to the problem of evil when we take that approach. We react to how we feel about the problem of evil. That is, we're talking about ourselves, you know, about our failure to have a solution, rather than finding a solution itself. So the solution is sort of left up in the air, whether there is one or not, and then the problem of evil, as it were, you know, is still on the table. We may be using this as a reason to set it aside, but it's not a solution. Okay. There's another reason why I'm happy with it. It seems to me to be inconsistent with a lot of scriptural things that are about. We're told that the oldest book in the Bible is the book of Job, and the book of Job is about gratuitous evil, right? And you know, and how one reacts to it. Professor Parsons mentions in his paper, I don't think it showed up in his talk, you know, that Job doesn't seem to get a solution to his problem. And I agree that he may not seem to, okay, but I want to come back to that at the end. Now, it's hard to think, you know, that this kind of concern will be so long-standing if the answer was going to be, forget it, you know, there's no way to know whether, you know, what's going on here, okay? If you get to the New Testament, then, my goodness, you know, you have Christ portrayed as overcoming the world, as so to speak, you know. So in the world you have suffering, but fear not, I have overcome the world, he says at one point. That's after the resurrection, okay? In the moral evil category, he's perceived as defeating the forces of sin, but generally, as in a sense, is kind of overcoming evil generally, okay? So I'm not sure what's to make of all that, and I'm not going to go into any kind of Christology or soteriology with you, but it's hard to think that there's no answer there either, you know, or no implied answer that Christianity would offer to some of these aspects of evil, okay? So I don't really like the idea of the unknown purpose approach. The role of religion is supposed to help us with these things, not leave us in the dark, so to speak. Okay. All right. Now you could try some sort of theodicy in response, right? Despite what Al would say. And we've already, you know, suggested one, which was free will theodicy, and of course there are a bunch of others. But I want to set the free will one aside. As I said, another one has gotten, another theodicy that's been offered is John Hick talks about soul making, right? And this is the view that suffering, you know, offers an opportunity for us to develop character, so to speak. You know, it's like on the golf course, you know, 3-foot putts, you know, to develop character. Okay, well, suffering does more, right? So by facing danger, we develop courage. By enduring pain, we develop patience. By helping others in their struggles, we develop charity, fellow feeling, all sorts of things like that, and are changed to, you know, for the better by our efforts in those areas. Okay, and we, you know, we do that. I mean, as parents, we do that. You know, we give our children chores to perform. Okay. Not just to help us out, right? Not just because we're too lazy to do the dishes, okay? I mean, after all, we did them for all those years when the kids were growing up. But you know, there's something good for them, and it's not just good that they get a sense of accomplishment out of it, but also they develop skills and they develop perseverance and industry and all those sorts of virtues, okay? I'm not really sure, though, that that's quite enough either for several reasons that I won't go into. But associated with Hick's view is another thing he has that I think begins to get us a little bit more to what might be an instructive, perhaps addition to his views, or an instructive way of approaching the problem. Part of what Hick does is he rejects what he calls a hedonic paradise, okay, which is a world in which everything goes hunky-dory, okay? That's like, what is in Brave New World? Soma that they take? Is that the stuff makes everybody feel good? Or in the Odyssey, the Lotus Eaters. Nobody reads the Odyssey anymore, but there they are, and they seem to be pretty happy folks, okay? But we look at those worlds, and actually there are worlds in which nothing ever goes wrong. There are worlds that are beneath contempt. We don't have any regard for those worlds at all, or for the people that occupy them. Right? There's something, I mean, it's not even human. Okay? There's something wrong there. Okay? And what that suggests is something like this, that in a good world, there's going to be evil to be faced. Okay? There's going to be the challenge of evil. Okay? And one good thing that happens sometimes in the world is that evil gets defeated. Okay, my favorite example of the defeat of evil, and this is a term that comes from Roderick Chisholm, those of you who are familiar to this idea. There's kind of a technical side to it that I won't go into. My favorite example, though, will illustrate it, and that's Beethoven overcoming his deafness, right? He's in mid-career. He gradually grows deaf. Kind of, I think it was a calcification of the bones of the inner ear. It could be fixed today in a 20-minute surgery. It's just that quick. But he winds up stone deaf. And yet he overcomes that, and he becomes a great composer, and most of his really, well, a lot of his really best stuff is written long after he's stone deaf. I mean, you can't hear a thing. These stories, you should read the story sometime of the first performance of the Ninth Symphony, where Beethoven is sitting in the middle of the orchestra. He thinks keeping time, and performance ends. They're bringing down the house, right? The soprano soloist has to go over and get him up from his chair and turn him around to face the audience so he can see what's happening, right? It's really, makes your hair stand up. Right? Okay, so that's a case of the defeat of evil, right? Where it's not just that one gets through, it's that one refutes the suffering on its own territory. And here he's deaf, and he's a composer. Okay, well, the heck with you, deafness. Right? It's that sort of thing, right? The other thing about this is not a causal means to something. Right? That is, when we talk about the defeat of evil in Beethoven's case, what we mean is that the evil itself, the deafness, is bound up in this process where the evil itself is overcome. So, right? So that what happens is, if you keep everything else the same, let Beethoven write all the same music, take away the deafness, which is an evil, and the world becomes a worse place. Because if you take away the evil, you take away the defeat of the evil, right? And that's a really super duper good, okay? All right, so here's a suggestion. If the defeat of evil is such a great good, and there are plenty others, I mean, the Green Revolution is a case of defeating evil, right? Or the Civil Rights Movement, or lots and lots of other things. Stuff that's going on about, trying to find cures for diseases and so forth. So here's a suggestion. It may be that part of God's enterprise in creating the world is the defeat of evil, right? That a world in which that was left out would be a vastly inferior world to the hedonic paradise of Hicks' imagination. Okay? Now, if that's right, this might be part of God's purpose. I'm afraid my voice is going here. Can I get somebody to grab me some water or something like that? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. One thing that follows immediately, if it turns out that that's part of God's purpose in creating the world, is that it's not true that a good God would minimize the occurrence of evil in any straightforward way. Rather, what happens is that you would expect there to be enough evil in the world that evil to allow its, comprehensive defeat. Okay? Maybe no more, no less, but nevertheless, that's a little bit different from just saying we're going to have the least amount possible. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how evil might be defeated. Okay? Well, one thing that happens is that the frequency and severity of evil often evokes responses on the part of individuals, okay, that are designed at overcoming it, okay? So that's what happens in the Green Revolution, right? What happens is you've got these starving people. People say, well, it'd be nice to have better yields for our agriculture, and so they try to devise ways of doing it. We think that's big time, right? I mean, the guy gets the Nobel Prize, is the leader in that movement. That's not small stuff. And And what happens is that, you know, the suffering of the world is diminished or eased a great deal. All right, on a small scale, it might be just, you know, easing the pain or suffering of a friend, you know, just comforting them. Right? It can even happen in a way, even where you don't even have beings that you would call rational beings. I remember a story I read or an article I read in Scientific American, this is quite a few years ago, about the way rabbits build their burrows. Okay? Usually, what they'll do, or often what they'll do, is they'll have one opening at a lower level than the other opening, if they can find a hillside, or they'll have one opening in the shade and the other in the sunlight. Various things like that. And what the effect of that is that you get ventilation in the burrow. Okay? You get some air flowing through there, and the little bunnies don't die. Okay, they don't suffocate. All right. Now you might say, all right, well, so what? You know, well, what happens is this: in some place along the way, rabbits had to develop that tendency, and the ones that developed that tendency had a survival thing. The others, of course, had less survival. And what happens at the demise of those poor unfortunate rabbits who didn't know about passive solar stuff leads to a situation in which you have a healthier, more robust, more survivable rabbit population, and that has nothing to do with reason. Okay. Similarly, it often happens in our own cases that it's not necessary that one intend to defeat the evil in order to defeat it. Right? Look at this place. We got electricity. We don't have to have candles getting the ceiling all smoky and greasy with the phlogiston that goes up there. We don't have to. You know, there are all kinds of stuff that we have. You know, warmth, shelter, right? Decent housing, flood survival, good clothes, right? Adequate food, all sorts of things that we have because people who have gone before us made the sacrifices and made the effort to bring those things about. Maybe just for their own good, not for, maybe they might never have thought of us. Maybe they did think of us. But it doesn't matter because the suffering that they would have to undergo, not having all these benefits, is in fact defeated by their reacting to it in such a way that it's diminished. You know, there's far less of it. Okay? Right? And that happens to be true, I think, of a lot of evil, is it just naturally calls forth its own demise in a way, because it calls forth reactions that actually eliminate it. Okay? All right, so that's the kind of thing, that's one way in which evil is defeated. And notice something about it. This is rather holistic, okay? All right, so take the suffering of Rose Fawn, okay? Now, that little guy has accomplished a lot of good, and he didn't even exist, okay? I mean, just think, you know, the good he's done for philosophy. And if he had actually been living, you know, it could have been maybe even more. So I have a lot of respect for that little guy. I think, you know, he's not to be pitied. He's to be admired, okay? But anyway, but just think of something like that, right? The way evil gets defeated in the story I was just telling you, or in the approach I was just telling you, is it's a holistic thing. There's no such thing as gratuitous evil, if it is the case that evil in general, right, calls forth our efforts to do something about it. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but couldn't we have gotten by with a few less burned up fawns? Well, maybe we could have. Maybe, given the hardness of our hearts, it would have been better if there had been 10 million more. How do you know? Right? It's just not obvious. Whether fewer would have been better or more would have been better. If you're a theist, you're going to sort of trust in God to establish the right amount, I guess. Okay? But those sorts of refinements I don't think are, you know, a special problem that, you know, for anybody. Okay, there's a second kind of defeat that's important in that, or way in which evil is defeated, and that's how it affects on, in the effects it has on us and the way we react, okay? One of the worst aspects of evil, maybe the worst, is its effects on us. You know, the potential it has to turn us into those complaining whiners that I was talking about at the beginning of the paper. Diminishes our hopes, and, you know, and our optimism and our ambitions, okay? deprives us of respect for ourselves. Okay, you see people, you know, who have suffered a lot of mistreatment, and they do have real problems, right? I mean, self-respect is a problem for a lot of, you know, someone once said in a talk I heard that all of us have a very nasty little secret, and that is we don't like ourselves very much. Okay? I'm inclined to think that something like that is right, okay? But there's some people, you know, and when you really get mistreated, or when people have suffered severe mistreatment, I mean, it really does have a harmful effect on them, and their self-regard, you know, does take a real beating. Okay, okay, that's the kind of thing that evil kind of effect that evil can have. But sometimes it doesn't, because it's possible to react in such a way as to treat the threat that evil presents to us as an occasion for making the effort to overcome it, maybe uniting our efforts to overcome it so that we work together on the thing and develop all the kinds of strengths that Hick talks about when he talks about soul building and so forth. Okay? Does it happen in every case? Well, certainly not everyone develops a lot of virtue. Well, maybe people do better at it than they often get credit for. Okay? But there are some people who go the other way, it looks like. It's not clear to me that that's all that necessary. You know, I don't develop virtue simply by responding to the evil that befalls me. Okay? So if my developing virtue helps defeat the evil that befalls you, it may not be necessary for you to do it. There's a tendency that we're in this together a little bit more than one supposes. So again, it's a sort of a holistic thing. So with that, let me turn to gratuitous evil for a minute because I'm running out of time. There are those cases of, I mean, if what I've been saying is correct, it might be that there really isn't, strictly speaking, anything such as egregious or that is gratuitous evil. One would hope so, from a theistic perspective. Okay, but there are cases that are really tough, and children dying of cancer, our own sufferings, as death approaches. Sometimes some people suffer a great deal, others don't. It can take all forms. Okay, not to get too, personal about it. My father was 89 years old when he died. He weighed 70 pounds. He was perfectly alert. He didn't have cancer. He didn't have anything. He just wasted away of old age. Right? He was blind from macular degeneration. There was practically nothing he could do but sit in a chair. Listen to my mother's soap operas on television. Okay, you can only take. Well, I don't know. I could only take so much of that. He seemed to be able to take it. Immensely. To develop really immense patience. Okay, but the thing is this. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, part of the effect of soul building in the Hickian idea, or the Hick's approach, is sort of a reversal of what happens as a result of human sin, which is essentially, in my understanding way, I don't have time to go into this, kind of a rebellion against God, okay? And when it looks like there's not much that can be done, okay, when what you've got is a situation of like some sort of terminal evil that's befallen somebody, and you might think to yourself, well, what can happen there, okay? Well, think about the case of Job, okay? The fact that Job doesn't receive an answer doesn't mean that we don't receive an answer by reading what Job says. He doesn't have to get an answer for us to get one, okay? And what happens in the case of Job is that he finally realizes not that God's purposes are utterly beyond him. That subject never comes up. What does come up is God saying, or God seems to think that he doesn't need moral justification for anything, okay? At least not to us, okay? Because he doesn't owe us an explanation. That seems clear. Maybe he needs moral justification on his own, but he doesn't owe us an explanation. Okay, and what happens is that Job finally realizes this, right? He realizes that God's position as his sovereignty as Lord of the universe is such that in the end, Job has no business calling God to task, right? He doesn't have the standing to do it, okay? And in effect, what he does is he shuts up. He says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Right, and then, God bails him out and gives him a different family. I'm not sure how much of a, I'm not sure that's the best way to go about it, but hey, it's up to God. Okay, so there is a possible answer. You see that when you're faced with the possibility of the suffering that just really does seem egregious, and we don't see anything about it. That one way of doing it is that you accept it completely, and you accept completely your reliance on God, and thereby give up finally the claim to yourself that constituted the sin of Adam, right? The claim that I'm not going to follow your rules. I'm going to engage in a grand project. I'm going to become like God. That's what he was up to. They weren't trying to, that's not, you got to realize what was going on there, right? This was not a small potatoes adventure that Adam and Eve were involved in, right? And if you only take the story as a model, you can see what it's about. It's about the fundamental kind of rebellion, and the way to defeat ultimately overcome the rebellion is to give up any claim to a right to yourself, and that's what can happen in the case of terminal suffering or very egregious pain like that. So it may be, you see, that the way to deal with seemingly egregious suffering or needless suffering is just to accept it, right? Or accept it trustingly, and that might be the ultimate defeat to the ultimate evil, which is the gratuitous evil. By the way, I might finish with one thing. One thing you got to expect, if this defeat business is part of what God's up to, is that there have to be cases in the world of seemingly gratuitous evil. Lots of it, because one dimension of evil is precisely, it seems like such a such a useless, horrible, wretched, terrible thing, right? So it ought to be that there'd be a lot of stuff out there that would that would look gratuitous. It would be very hard to see. And finally, you might not see anything to do except just sit still. But in the sitting still, that might actually be what was called for, right? That's what Job did, right? He never got an explanation from God, but that is the answer that we got from the book of Job. That's what we were given. So there's a religious treatment of the problem of evil that is shallow, frivolous. What was that other one? Frivolous, shallow, tepid. I like that. That's the best adjective of them all. So thanks very much for listening, Jimmy. What do you think?
Oh, it's fine with me, sure.
Yeah, okay. Let's just do it that way. That'd be fine.
Yes, it's
That'd be fine, because I said a couple things about yours actually in mine. So you want to say a couple things?
well, actually, I did want to say one thing, is that actually I had not read your piece, Pointless Suffering, how to make the problem of evil, make the problem of evil sufficiently serious. I had not read this before writing this. If I had, I don't think I would have so facilely quoted what Plantinga says here about it being frivolous and trivial and whatnot, because I thought
it was my lead-in. Come on, it was the best thing you could have done.
I thought it was incredibly good, if I may say so. So I think it's one of the best things I've read on the problem of evil, in fact. So yeah. So.
Thanks very much.
Oh, well, if you ask me a question, let me ask you. My personal evil is the same as Beethoven's. I'm going deaf, and I can't yet afford the $4,500 yet for the hearing aid, which is what they're priced these days. So if you ask me a question, please feel free to speak up, okay?
Question for you. So take the simple case where a friend is suffering, maybe great pain, some sort of illness, and you comfort them. Is that a better situation than if they didn't suffer at all?
Well, if in fact what happens there is a response on your part that tends toward the defeat of the evil, then yes, it is, in principle, yes.
It sounds like your values are quite different than mine, because, if I were in a situation where I had a friend suffering, right, and I could push a button that would eliminate the suffering, and so I wouldn't, so to speak, be able to comfort them over long periods of time.
That's the same thing, right? I mean, the comfort is not some sort of feel-good thing. I mean, the comfort is to get to a position where the suffering is less painful for them.
Well, let me put it a different way. Suppose that there were an accident, then that, I mean, something happened that, you know, just at the point they're beginning to suffer before I had a chance to comfort them, right? There was supposed to be an accident, but here eliminate the suffering that was predictable, right? Now then, I mean, the suffering would have been eliminated along with my comforting, right?
Sure, right. So nothing that you did would have defeated it.
No, right, but would the world be better or worse for that having happened?
For what? The accident having happened?
The accident having happened would cut off my opportunity to comfort them while
Well,
they're
you've got no shortage of opportunities to address the problem, or to address actual evil. So that's not.
Well, suppose that were the only case. I want to know what you think, okay, right? Is the world better having the combination of the suffering and the comforting response than it would be if the suffering hadn't occurred?
Given that the suffering occurs, okay, and that you do the comforting, the world would be a worse place if the suffering were taken out. Now, if the suffering never occurs and there's no opportunity for the comforting, then there's no issue.
I think your values on this are different than the values of most people, but I may be wrong about that.
Yeah, I think if I could interject here, yeah, I think that's one of the things that seems to me is that, you know, this seems sort of an inversion of the way we normally think about things in our ordinary moral judgments that we make. For instance, I might be able to say, well, sure, the defeat of evil or overcoming adversities, overcoming challenges, certainly you're right, that a world in which there would be a hedonistic paradise would be a fool's paradise. I agree with that. You know, a brave new world like Aldous Huxley's, where it's all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That sounded good to me when I first read it at age 17. I didn't see any downside to it. But you know, and now, of course, I think I would. You know, we'd all be worthless, stupid lotus eaters if that were the world. But surely, let's take something like the Second World War, 60 million people killed and untold, inconceivable amounts of suffering. It seems to go strongly against our most basic ethical intuitions and ordinary ethical judgments to say that it was better that we had the Second World War, that we had a Hitler, that we had Japanese imperialism and militarism, that it might be defeated, and that all the acts of bravery and courage, etc., could have been shown, than if there had been some way that we could have stopped Hitler before he became, you know, quite so powerful and aggressive, and that we could have curbed Japanese militarism and thereby prevented the greatest disaster that has afflicted human beings, with the possible exception of the Black Death of the 14th century, which is the Second World War. Indeed, I think we would say that people who, you know, President Kennedy and, you know, Nikita Khrushchev, who prevented nuclear holocaust, certainly did a very good thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis in World War II. So it seems to me that while I could have empathy with your point of view about defeating evil to some extent, when we're talking about the big evils, the Holocaust, the genocide, the world wars, it seems to go strongly against our most basic ethical intuitions.
Well, first of all, if one could have, you know, gotten Hitler out of the way, say in 1939, knowing what was going to happen if one didn't. Of course, maybe that's too good, you know, it's easy to say that. But if one could have, obviously one would have, thereby defeating evil. Knowing what human suffering is like in wartime, knowing what an evil it is, one diminishes it by, let's say, knocking off Hitler. A couple of people tried to do it. So it's not as if that wouldn't be an example of evil being defeated. Now, if you ask yourself, okay, is it the case that there is no good that comes out of the Second World War that consists in the defeat of, or that's involved in the defeat of the evils that in fact were allowed to fester and grow? I would say that the defeat itself is a magnificent good. I mean, people read about it all the time. You get movie after movie after movie. You know, people do that because the heroism of those people, of some of those people, is very, very admirable, and so yeah, an awful lot of great stuff comes, and that's not all that happened, right? Even the Japanese, who, you know, are considered so evil, the one thing the Japanese taught the Asians is that you can make the Western powers run, and that had enormous consequences after the war.
A small follow-up on this first point. Suppose I become convinced that sometimes provided that I react to my friend in the right way and we defeat the evil together, that it's better that the accident occurred and we engaged in this healing process together than if it had not occurred at all.
Yeah.
Is there anything wrong with the following reasoning? I decide that I want to make the world a better place, and I wait for freezing temperatures, and I get out the hose, and I ice down the sidewalk, and I invite the friends over and orchestrate a fall. Then I appropriately tend to them,
Sure.
and we defeat that evil together.
Sure. Well, probably not, because you start out by enlisting on the side of the enemy there, and it's
My goal
a
is to
bit.
maximize
No, wait a
value.
minute. No, it's hypocritical then to turn around and say, well, I'm actually on the side of the angels. in
My
this.
only hope was to maximize value, and if I became convinced that this was the way to generate the best state of affairs, I might have been attempting to walk with the angels.
Well, the best state of affairs would be generated by your trying to overcome evil, not by your producing it. Right? There's enough out there to be overcome without your having to increase the amount. I don't see,
Is it evil or gratuitous evil that some populations experience evil across time? Indigenous populations of Hmong and lower caste group, people of African descent, women, etc. Are they experiencing evil or are they experiencing gratuitous evil? And how do you account for the fact that some groups experience greater evil than others? What justifies it?
you want me?
I think that's the
Whoever.
question for.
Yeah, okay. First of all, any gratuitous evil is evil. So my position is just that there might not be any gratuitous evil. So, do some people suffer more than others? I don't know. Okay, it certainly looks that way to me. Okay, but I don't know what's going on inside people. So maybe there are differences, that I don't know about. But yeah, some people seem to suffer more than others. Some people certainly are hungrier than others. Some people suffer more violence than others. Some people are in greater poverty than others. Okay, is that gratuitous? Well, I don't see simply that there's a difference between people as to how much they suffer. I don't think that makes their suffering gratuitous. Now, maybe there's some other things that might make it gratuitous. Maybe they don't do anything about it. Right? If they didn't, they'd have a better chance of it being gratuitous than if they did try to do something about it. Maybe nobody tries to do anything about it. Well, then it would have a better chance of being gratuitous than if somebody tried to do something about it. Right?
May I interject? In a debate with Professor Craig, I had a couple of them. One was before an audience of 4,500, about 4,450 of whom were on his side, okay? We were talking about this very question. What about people who suffer unjustly, the sufferings of, small children, this sort of thing? And Professor Craig, part of his answer to the problem of evil is that all such undeserved suffering will receive recompense in the afterlife. That, those who have suffered dreadfully here, inequitably here, will receive, great rewards in the afterlife, and so that in heaven, the evils of this world will appear to be shrink to a mathematical point in comparison to the goods, that sort of thing. And my response back was, this seems very odd to me. I mean, what if there were an eccentric multi-billionaire who received pleasure from going around and randomly selecting people and beating them to a bloody pulp, and then giving them a check of $10 million to recompense them for their, many of us might sign up to be beaten to a bloody pulp, right? Okay, those of us who are paid philosopher salaries might say, beat me, okay? All right, so yeah, surely we would consider such an eccentric billionaire not to be a good person. In fact, he ought to go to jail, okay? When I mentioned this, Professor Craig reacted mostly with anger. He seemed to get very angry. He thought that I had trivialized the whole thing, but honestly, I don't think that I am. Honestly, I was making a very good point that immense rewards later do not make up for intense, horrible, grievous suffering inflicted, upon the undeserving in the present day. And that seemed to be the, point of my point there. And I can't tell that Dr. Craig responded to it by getting mad.
Well,
Let me just say that I agree entirely with everything you just said.
But in fact, I think it trivializes it when you say that pain is subjective. And because pain is subjective, you don't know how much pain someone We know that death is final. And so if people die in large numbers as a result of having an immutable characteristic, then we know that death is final, and we also know that those people who experience that pain, who experience that death, and we can use Holocaust as an example, we can't blame them for experiencing the Holocaust, because how could they go up against the German state?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's sort of
Some of them did.
I guess it's sort of rhetorical. But
Some of them did go up against the Germans.
Okay, but it's not a fair fight.
No, it's not.
Okay. And so I don't think that we can assign responsibility to those individuals, and certainly that's sort of implicit in the response that you provided.
Why?
Because
Why was it implicit?
you're saying that the people who don't take on
Oh, so they could try and do something about themselves. Yeah, they should. And if they hang around and wait for somebody else to do something about it, that is not as good as if they try to do something on their own. Because what they're going to find out is that the other people aren't helping them out anywhere near as much as they might imagine.
Yeah, I think it won't be time for one more question.
Maybe this is a different topic. It's directed to Keith Parson. So in your, I heard you talk about natural evil and moral evil, but I didn't really hear the definition of evil. I mean, I didn't know if natural and moral referred to the cause. I mean, what is your definition of evil, or what's your?
That's an excellent question, because actually talking about moral evil and natural evil, you're really talking about two different kinds of things. I mean, moral evil, and some people have even said that they think that they're so different that natural evil should not even be called evil. It's just natural evil would be natural occurrences brought about by the operation of the impersonal laws of nature that bring about vast amounts of grievous, undeserved, unwanted suffering, dire suffering, that sort of thing. Again, inoperable cancers and that sort of thing, which are brought about, which occur in people through no fault of their own. Okay, we're not talking about cases like, the 3-pack-a-day smoker who may be to some extent responsible, but terrible diseases, illnesses, natural disasters that cause intensely horrible, grievous, undeserved, unwanted suffering.
So evil is intense suffering. Is that what? I mean, is there a difference between intense suffering and mild suffering in this definition of evil?
Evil is one of those. It is probably unavoidably a vague term. Okay, it's a vague term, and it probably it is used generally speaking. When we talk about evil, we talk about things which are, as you say, particularly or intensely painful. We might even come up with a problem of trivial pains. Would a good God allow mosquito bites? Okay, that's actually that's not trivial here in Southeast Texas. Okay, in Houston area, what about would a good God permit things? We might not call these evils. We might just call it the problem of irritation. Okay, and that might be a different kind of problem that would be involved there. Does this address your question?
Well, that's what I kind of want to know. Is the problem of irritations rise to the level of what we're calling the problem of evil? In other words, we have these two premises which seem incompatible about God and evil, although I'm not quite sure what it is. And irritation brings the same challenge.
I think that there probably is no, it's probably one of those things that's a continuum. There's probably no mathematical point. It's like when I went to physical therapy not too long ago. They have a scale of 1 to 10. So, they're pulling on your arm or pulling on your leg or something and say, okay, tell me how much this hurts on a scale of 1 to 10, where, 1 is just mild irritation and 10 is, being tortured on the rack. So they say, does this hurt? Yes, 6. Okay. And that sort of thing. So probably it is, a matter of scale like that. And this is one of those, evil then is simply one of those vague terms which we deploy and unavoidably deploy in ordinary language to encompass a variety of different kinds of suffering and
could
difficulty.
Could an omnipotent God allow and permit sort of trivial suffering or moderate suffering? I mean,
It's not true.
Okay, I'm going to let people go.
Yeah, sure.
Let's thank our guests, and then if you want to stick around for